good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good whenever you're reviewing this material. My name is Lauren Berger, and I am the training coordinator for Restore Sexual Assault Services. This program is the historical intersections of sexual violence and anti-Black violence in the United States. This program is the product of some internal research that I personally have done and that Restore has been engaging in for the last couple of years with regard to our perspective as advocates for survivors of sexual violence and what it means for us to understand the context in which survivor advocacy has evolved and some of the different overlying systems of oppression at play that not only it's important to be mindful of, but to be aware of connections. So firstly, let me say again, welcome, and to just provide a bit of a content warning and to provide guidance as far as taking care of yourself. This program is going to take in totality about 2 hours, and it can be pretty difficult content. We're also going to be moving at a pretty good clip. We are going to move through the first 258 years of United States history in just the first couple of slides. And then we're going to move through another 80 years of history throughout the rest of the slides. So knowing that, feel free to get, some water or something else, your favorite drink, your favorite snack, something comfy, and kind of settle in for just kind of engaging with material that might be a lot and that we might be moving through fairly quickly. We don't move through it quickly to minimize or to gloss over any of the difficult material, but in the interest of being able to capture the volume of what we're aiming to do here in the amount of time that we have. So I just want to invite folks to take kind of a deep breath as we begin this program. Some housekeeping before we dive in. Like I said, I work for Restore Sexual Assault Services. We are a rape crisis program in 5 counties in the state of New York. Those counties are Monroe, Orleans, Genesee, Livingston, and Wyoming. And actually in Wyoming County, we also provide support for survivors of domestic violence. So we provide services 24/7. There's our hotline number right on the screen. Those services are all free and they are all confidential. This program was initially presented during April, during which we have a Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign. And the national program provides prompts for each day of April, so 30 days of SAM. And this presentation debuted publicly for day 12 because the theme for that day was a little known fact. And our little known fact for our Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign was that Black women have always led the fight and the advocacy for survivors, and that sexual violence and the advocacy for survivors of sexual violence has always had a very close proximity to other forms of advocacy and of, folks striving for their rights. And so this program is really a product of not only us becoming aware of that, but specifically reading this book that the cover of which is photographed here on the left. It's At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle L. McGuire. A lot of the material that I'm presenting in these slides is directly from that book. It's a great starting point for sort of learning this material. A lot of more material is referenced in the notes section. And this program also comes with an accompanying piece of sources to learn more. Books, videos, articles, podcasts, whatever medium suits your fancy. And the idea is that this is maybe a starting point for folks, but that there's a lot more material out there. And to just kind of encourage folks to bear that in mind. And that this program, again, is moving through things very fast, but that we're not doing that in an effort to shy away from these difficult topics, but in order to capture the breadth of material that we aim to do in the amount of time that we have to do it. I mentioned Restore a little bit, and this slide just unpacks a little bit of the services that we offer. We mentioned our 24-hour hotline, and through that, folks often access other services such as in-person counseling or even therapy, which is available through Restore. Sometimes folks are looking for advocacy and accompaniment. That can be through the medical system, through the criminal justice process, through even family court, and it could be through a student conduct process, either in a college campus or in a K-12 school. So we provide advocacy and accompaniment for survivors in that regard as well. We provide referrals and information to other needed services. We provide educational workshops, not unlike this one. And we provide assistance through the New York State Office of Victim Services, which is a program that provides compensation for survivors through monetary losses that they may have suffered as the result of the assault. So I mentioned all these services for survivors, but I also want to highlight that we serve loved ones of survivors, friends, family members, partners, others looking for information, looking for how they can support a friend. So if anybody is in need of those services, folks are welcome to call our hotline. Even outside of our 5 counties, we'll be able to get you the number for the program in your area, because every county in the United States has a designated, rape crisis program. So I mentioned a tiny bit about this actual program, and I want to just kind of highlight our objectives here. So this program aims to provide a very brief overview of sexual violence in anti-Black oppression and present in larger efforts for civil rights. So I say brief because, again, we are covering a lot of material really fast. So we are very much skipping the stone across the pond here. Another objective is to identify connections between historical events and events that occurred in much more recent past. And one objective I want to give folks is to note your reactions, note how you're feeling when different materials or subjects come up. Take a note of that, and take a note of where you'd like to learn more. Because what we're hoping is that, again, this program is not the end of our discussion of our journey, but a beginning. Some of the things that are present in this program you might be hearing about for the very first time. And I want to give folks that courtesy that we can come into a space with grace and forgiveness for what we didn't know. Every single person out there had, a first day. And if this is your first day, well, then we're glad that you're here. So the original title of this program was actually Overlaps of Racial and Sexual Violence. But as I continued to put this material together, I quickly realized that when we talk about racial violence, it's much more expansive than what we're talking about here. And that if we want to be clear, then this material really speaks specifically to anti-Black violence. There is a lot of instances of white supremacist violence on populations that we are not covering in this PowerPoint. Folks like Asian Americans, indigenous communities, and on and on and on. That's not only due to our time constraints, but also the focus of this specific material. Our goal at Restore is to actually start with 3 other programs that will be very similar to this one, focusing specifically on anti-Indigenous violence, anti-Latinx violence, and anti-Asian American and Pacific Islander violence. Because we've realized that those nuances have their own entrenched history, and we want to do justice in the best way we can to the unique experiences of those communities. And so I just wanted to kind of establish that asterisk for this program. No one is asking us to know everything. Nobody's asking anybody to be omniscient, because we're constantly learning. We are constantly having various degrees of success and failure. So this note on where you want to learn more, this is a really great place to kind of take note of those things of this was the first time I'd heard about that. I definitely want to learn more about that. And this is a great way to do that. All right. So with one more deep breath, this last kind of housekeeping slide establishes some of our expectations for just our time together, or our virtual time together. So again, some of this stuff might be literally the first time you've heard this information. So we can accept, and have humility that we didn't know these things, and that we still are learning. We will continue to learn. And the best way to continue to learn is to approach this material with an open mind, and the idea that it might go against the narrative that we were told when we were in school, when we were in college, or wherever, and that there maybe is a reason that this is the way there may be a reason why we're hearing things this way, positioned this way, for the very first time here and now. So it's okay for us to be vulnerable. It's okay for us to feel discomfort or maybe even feel challenged in our own worldview as we go through this material. And it's okay for you to really register your own feelings. What's going on with you? Maybe you need to even pause the program, and go get another drink, or take a walk. But that if we have assumptions about what's covered here or about how it makes us feel, I want us to really maybe sit in that discomfort and challenge ourselves. I'm not asking for folks to be in a place where they feel emotionally unsafe, but for us to remember that, like we have here on the slide, the comfort zone is a very fine place, but nothing ever grows there. If we want to grow and expand our mindset, then it's very, very important for us to, when we're able, to sit with that discomfort and to challenge those assumptions. Okay. So like I said, we're going to move through this fairly quickly. I want to start with the graphics that are here on the slide. Very quickly, we have on the left a timeline of some events in American history regarding the conditions of Black people. The book At the Dark End of the Street starts in about the 1930s, which is why the title on the slide is some pretext. So this slide covers the entirety of this red line and part of, this yellow line. So this timeline here covers some of those major events in American history. And this graphic over here is an indication of some of the different conditions in which Black people were brought to the colonial, what would become the United States in the early 1600s. So it's actually, it's a cartoon. And these were some of the conditions that enslaved people endured while they were brought to the quote unquote New World on slave ships. So enslaved people it's important for us to understand that enslaved people were seen as objects. And because the conditions of enslavement followed the mother, children were born into slavery. And if they were born into slavery, they were going to be a slave or enslaved in perpetuity. And it was all but obliged for someone who is an enslaver to attempt to create more slaves. And this was done through the sexual violence of enslaved women. The idea of a white man assaulting an enslaved woman and creating a pregnancy was almost a business incentive, as crude and callous and bizarre as that sounds. So when we talk about the unique experiences of Black people in the United States, it's important for us to remember that sexual violence, and indeed what we would define as human trafficking, was there from the very inception of the idea of the United States as a nation. This happened even more frequently after 1808, and we see on our timeline here, that is because there was a ban on bringing more enslaved people from Africa. So when we talk about these things, it's important for us to really be aware of some of the different conditions in what would become the United States and how the consequences of that played out, for enslaved people. So this timeline is basically as chattel slavery developed. So when we talk about chattel slavery, that's the condition where it follows the mother. That is something that very quickly was unique to the United States. Often when we talk about conditions of enslavement happening in other countries around the same time, it was very conditional. And there often would be a time that folks would be freed from enslavement after their duty was served or their debt was paid, those sorts of things. And there actually was, indentured servants who were coming, to American colonies. And in the 1600s, that was when things transitioned. That was when actually laws were written in the Virginia colony that established differences between indentured servitude, which would have been white, European, British folks. Those would be classified as indentured servants, and they distinguished that from people from Africa who were enslaved. And the chattel slavery is that the idea that, If you are a woman and you have a child, that child will be enslaved. If that child has a child, they will be enslaved. That and on and on and on. And very quickly, that actually becomes pretty unique to the United States. So that specifically, especially after, again, 1808, other countries begin to abolish enslavement. And so very quickly, the United States becomes unique in not only the preservation of enslavement in and of itself, but this idea of chattel slavery, of the in perpetuity. And even by 1800, we have 10 generations of folks who have been enslaved. So those of us who are looking at this with a lens toward the neurobiology of trauma and generational trauma, what does 10 generations of enslavement mean for folks? So some other things of note, we're not going to go through every single event on this timeline, but some other things of note is I want to come down here to the year 1855 and the case of Missouri versus Celia. So Celia was an enslaved woman, and she murdered her enslaver after enduring years of sexual assault. And so the trial was in 1855 after she had murdered her enslaver, or what we would maybe define today as a trafficker. But the court ruled that because she was enslaved, she could not refuse consent, and she was not entitled to bodily autonomy. The court ruled that she was guilty. She was convicted by a jury of 12 white men. She was sentenced to death, and she was hung in December of that year. By 1860, 4 million people in the United States were enslaved. Very high percentage of the population in not only the entire country, but specifically in the South, because at this point, several northern states had individually abolished enslavement. So when we think about the proportion of enslaved folks in only the states where they were enslaved, we're looking at nearly half of that population. And certainly by 1860, there were even more folks, 4 million people. And we all know, or maybe we don't know, but maybe we all know, that in the 1860 election, when Abraham Lincoln was elected, that led southern states to declare that they were seceding, and it ignited the Civil War. And I do want to, move on. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the actual Civil War. I would love to, because in my pedestrian life, I'm also a reenactor for the Union Army. And so I know actually a particular bit about the Civil War in and of itself. So I just want to say kind of one thing. When we talk about the Civil War, one thing that's really important for us to articulate very clearly is that the Civil War was 110% about enslavement. It was the backbone and the way of life in the American South. And if we read the declarations of secession of the southern states when they left, they make this very, very clear. The preservation of chattel slavery was the reason they left the Union. And of course, the Civil War began because they left the Union. So I'll often, say that we can name every branch or we can name the tree. And the tree is named enslavement. Right? Every single person in the American South, and indeed many people in the North, profited from slavery, which was the backbone of the economy in the South. So after the Civil War, we have several amendments during what was called Reconstruction, which is the time period from 1866 to 1876. And that gave Black people citizenship, and it gave Black men the right to vote, but not necessarily the access. And shortly after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan, America's original domestic terrorist, was born. And it was actually started by several Confederate veterans during Reconstruction. And as violence and riots began to spread, even in 1866, there was the first of many, many large riots in Memphis, Tennessee. Sexual violence was universally included in these riots. So I just want to point out, back to this graphic a little bit, we think about enslavement and the Civil War and all this as being eons ago. This was so long ago, nobody even thinks about any of this stuff. It has absolutely zero connection to what we do today. It was so long ago. But when we think about the context in terms of how long enslavement went on, and comparatively how long we have been without conditions of enslavement, it really doesn't seem like it was that long. And I usually point out at this point that I actually have an ancestor who was a part of the Union Army. He was actually wounded during the Battle of Gettysburg. And he is 7 generations behind me. So if I, go back to my, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great, on and on, he is 7 generations behind me. And when we think about 10 generations of enslavement by 1800, the comparison, the idea that this was in the very distant past sort of dwindles away. These are pictures of slave patrol badges. This is how law enforcement began in the American South. It's important for us to understand this history when we consider the relationship of the Black communities to law enforcement. People who resisted slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, that I'll explain on another slide, were breaking the law. And people who supported enslavement, segregation, Jim Crow, were enforcing it. So when we talk about systemic inequity, we're talking about things that are built into the society by design. The first slave patrol was actually in a Carolina colony in 1704. It was very, very early. This is just about as old, as the colonies themselves. There were different types of law enforcement in major cities around this time. There were like magistrates, things like that. But when we think about deputies and people being deputized, and especially, again, in the South and in more rural communities, this is how law enforcement began in the United States. And we definitely see some connections even to some of the iconography and some of the different, indeed, shapes of the badges all the way up through to today. So as promised, I'm going to unpack Jim Crow and moving forward with a bit more of again, the pretext. So the name Jim Crow actually comes from, it was the name of a character in a minstrel show. Minstrel shows were parodies of Black stereotypes made for the amusement of white audiences. They were actually really popular all over the nation. Minstrel shows were performed by white people in blackface. And one of the popular characters in many minstrel shows was named Jim Crow. And it became the name of the era of segregation laws. And these were both, actual codified laws, such as black codes that were passed in various states right after the Civil War. And things like voter suppression, like a literacy test or a poll tax, but also in, social norms and socialized nuances, like the inherent risk of violence for registering to vote or for trying to vote, or, for Black people having anything that white people thought they shouldn't have. And not only was this, their social segregation norms, but there also was a tremendous amount of violence, and many times in the form of riots. So even during Reconstruction, which was, again, the period after the Civil War where the Union Army was present in various, like the South was actually carved up into military districts, and each of the districts were overseen, by Army. So Reconstruction was, the enforcement of post-Civil War equality measures somewhat. As we see, there's still 24 riots, during that time. But it formally ended in 1876, not because it was working, but to appease the Southern electoral delegates in a presidential election that was a little too close to call. So the trade-off was that Rutherford B. Hayes would be seated as president, and in exchange for the support of the Southern delegates, the Union Army would leave the South, and that Reconstruction would formally end. And it was replaced by a violent effort to reassert the quote-unquote status quo that had existed before the Civil War, which resulted in the Jim Crow era. So when we talk about riots, briefly they can be defined in this context as mass violence to almost exclusively Black-owned businesses and homes. And sometimes they were catalyzed by rumors of sexual violence, and they almost always included sexual violence during the riot, during the violence. So rumors of sexual violence against white women by Black men actually was the spark for the riots in both Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in Rosewood, Florida. And folks may have heard about the riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma more recently than folks ever had. In Tulsa, Hundreds were killed, thousands were injured, and nearly $33 million in today's dollars in damage was done to Black-owned businesses, churches, and homes. White press, like white-owned press organizations, often would call these, race riots, and they either would be blamed on, the alleged spark of the riot, i.e., whatever Black people did that white people didn't want them to do, and so they, a little victim blaming going on, or there was equal both sides. And when we look at the toll of, again, injury, death, property damage, there's definitely not equal sides going on. So the earliest advocacy or speaking out against the rape of Black women by white men was Ida B. Wells, who's, this photo here in the bottom center of the slide. This photo of her was taken in 1893 or 94. She was a teacher and a journalist, and she co-owned a newspaper in Memphis called The Free Speech. A good friend of hers was killed by a white mob at the People's Grocery, which was a store that he co-owned. And after that happened, she turned her journalistic focus to lynchings, which we can define as killing without a trial. She noted that hundreds of Black women had been lynched by white men, and that white men were perpetrators of rampant sexual violence against Black women, and that nobody ever seemed to, society never really seemed to care. And this quotation in the bottom left of the slide was something that she actually ran in her newspaper, is that nobody in the country believes this threadbare lie. The Black men are out here raping white women. And after that editorial, a white mob destroyed the office of the Free Speech. And they told her, she was in New York at the time, and they said, if you come back to Memphis, you will be killed. So she continued to write about lynching and about its links to sexual violence. She argued that the portrayal of Black men as rapists put them beyond the pale of human sympathy. And she suggested that this focus concealed the rape of Black women, and it gave cover to whites' violence and their efforts to rob African Americans of their rights, and their property. So she would actually be a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and she would work in civil rights and in politics until the end of her life in 1931. The other graphic on this page is a poster for a film called The Birth of a Nation. It was America's first blockbuster. It was released in 1915, and it was based on the novel The Klansman that was published in 1905. So the story basically rested hugely on the stereotype that Black men were predators and they assaulted white women. And the rescuing of white women and the punishment of Black men positioned the Klansmen as heroes in the story. It's really difficult to overstate how important this film was for Americans tacitly accepting these stereotypes. This film was the first to ever be screened at the White House. The president, Woodrow Wilson, loved it. He called it, quote, history written with lightning, and all the better because it is terribly true, close quote. Notice even on the poster, our, quote unquote hero, a Klansman, rides next to a white woman as her protector. So this film was very popular. It was very early. It's very well known. But we see this plot device at the retribution for violence against white womanhood. We see this over and over and over, reinforcing these stereotypes, these ideas, and indeed this call to violence. So this goes back to the idea of the system. Again, this is baked into the system by design, right? It's not a bug, it's a feature. So I want to just define a couple of different terms for folks as we kind of move toward what we're actually here to talk about, which begins in the 1940s. So when we talk about redlining, we mean design in cities or by home lending mortgage corporations to make sure that certain neighborhoods were only for white people. It was also a great way to decide where better schools, better stores, or a highway was going to be built. So the zones in the towns were literally coded by color. Green and blue were desirable. Yellow was definitely declining, quote unquote. And quote unquote hazardous was in red. And that was reserved specifically for Black people. This photo is a map from 1939. And it's from the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation of the city of Rochester, New York. And I chose Rochester, New York as our example because I wanted to point out that this was happening all over the country. We often talk about systemic racism being exclusive to the American South. And I want us to remember that that is not true at all. In fact, redlining is sometimes referred to as the Jim Crow of the North. This idea that, again, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And sundown towns were literal towns where no black people were allowed other than, as a day laborer or a domestic worker. Being there after dark was enough to justify their murder. Law enforcement knew about this. Local officials knew about this. They enforced this. The Green Book was sort of a response to this. It was published in 1936 by Victor Green. And it's, in essence, a list of friendly places and restaurants, hotels, etc., that would serve black people. And it helped black families, travel the U.S. in safety and in dignity. Because this was, the early 20th century. Americans, were hitting the open road and hitting Route 66, and one thing I learned putting this program together is that when Route 66 opened in the year 1930, of the 89 counties on Route 66, 44 of them were sundown towns. So when we talk about how racism is systemic, we're meaning that it is baked in. It is put there by design. It's not the system failure. It's the system working exactly as it was designed. It's not a bug. It's a feature. And as I was putting these slides together, I thought about, let's just do an experiment. And so I got this map from 1980 of the highways around the city of Rochester. And it was pretty clear to me where those highways, notably the inner loop, was chosen to be, who was going to be displaced from their homes. And as we wrap up our pretext here, one of the more somber pieces of this is for us to talk a little bit more about lynching. So lynching is defined, again, as killing someone without a trial. So if we think about a lynch mob, that's anybody more than 3 people. Often, when we talk about lynching, we think about hanging. In this context, lynching is a very violent, very public killing. Some were, spontaneous and by small groups, but many, many more were, kind of went down like this. A suspect would be accused of a crime. They'd be arrested. Without a trial, they would be held in jail. Their guilt would be announced in newspapers. Mobs of thousands of people would gather. Sometimes a quote-unquote trial would happen. Typically, they were a trial in name only. They'd be under an hour, and they would not let the accused person testify. So often, these quote-unquote trials were skipped altogether. So when we talk about the events themselves, these would often include dismemberment, body parts being taken as trophies, genital mutilation, burning alive, being dragged behind vehicles, and the remains of victims would be on display for days. So with a modern lens, we would define this as terrorism. This is terrorism. These events were attended by families, women and children, public officials, law enforcement. Sometimes law enforcement was actually facilitating. It would let them out into the jail to collect this person. This graphic is a map from the Equal Justice Initiative, which will be a link in the supportive documents to learn more about the projects that they have about documenting lynchings. The dots are corresponding to where you can learn more on the site, so they actually don't serve a purpose right now. So what they do show is kind of the brighter the red, the more events. This map captures events from 1877 to 1950. So again, after the end of Reconstruction, up through 1950. So before 1877, during Reconstruction, from 1866 to 1877, 2,000 people were lynched. They were documented to be lynched in these southern states, which was a direct backlash to Reconstruction itself and to the advancement of rights, for Black people and increase in civic participation. This map shows the 4,000 folks that were lynched between 1877 and 1950. And we say documented because we know that there are doubtlessly at least thousands more that were undocumented. And this map only shows, again, part of the country. And it's important for us to remember that lynchings occurred in the North as well. There's a particularly violent riot in New York City during the Civil War where dozens of black men were lynched. So again, this is not exclusive to the American South. But when we think about this context, it's difficult to imagine not only that this is a possibility, but that this is almost the norm. So as we think about that, that brings us to, setting us up for where the dark end of the street begins. So some context to bring us to the state of Alabama, which is where it's going to begin. The book begins itself in 1944, but leading up to that, in the 1930s, there were a couple of high-profile cases. So in the early 1930s, Myrtis Dixon was a 12-year-old girl. She was raped at knife point by a man who had hired her to work in his home. Police refused to arrest the man, and that was the end of the story. This was a very, very typical scenario. A larger, more high-profile case was in 1931. 2 white women were taken off of a train with 9 black boys, and the 2 white women said that the 9 black boys had all raped them. The National Guard was actually dispatched to the jail to stop the lynch mob that had gathered outside. Within 2 weeks, all 9 of these boys had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in the electric chair. So there was a national rallying of groups, mostly the NAACP and the International Labor Defense, and new trials were had, legal interventions happened, and all were acquitted, all left prison. The last, though, did not leave until 1950. And then as we rocket toward 1944, when the book begins, there were more than, almost 250, again, violent clashes or riots in 47 cities all over the country. And if they were not about black people seeking the right to vote, they were about a rumor of a black man raping a white woman. And we say rumors because, again, no trial ever happened. Most involved an accusation, or there was some alleged contact or conduct between a black man and a white woman. There was never asking if it was consensual or not, almost as though that didn't matter. Or they were the result of quote-unquote bad conduct from a black man, which could literally mean anything. Literally, like he looked at me wrong. Could be enough. And when we think about the punishment, these were often, again, lynching, torturous public killing, memorabilia produced, some of the most cruel, inhumane torture that folks can even think of. So as a survivor advocate, this was a twist because we are trained to believe survivors without question. But when we think about this context, one thing that stood out to me was that the word, the desire, the agency of a survivor, or indeed whether or not there was a survivor at all, was almost never known. And so this idea that, someone said he hurt someone was all that it took. And so as a survivor advocate, it's important for us to not only be mindful and believe survivors, but to look critically at whether or not indeed there is a survivor, or if perhaps the rumor of a survivor is merely the vehicle to perpetrate white supremacist violence. And the graphic here is just a map of the state of Alabama, and there is a star down here at Abbeville, Alabama, because that is where our story begins at the dark end of the street in 1944. Reese Taylor was a 24-year-old woman living in Abbeville, Alabama, on her way home from church on a September evening with actually a couple of friends when she was abducted by 7 men in a car and taken away. The witnesses, her friends, ran and told her father and the sheriff, and several hours later they found Reese walking alone down the side of the dirt road. So this was a small town. Folks had some idea of at least who the driver of the car was. And Reese knew them herself. We also knew the sheriff. He questioned one man who the witnesses, again, identified as the driver. That man identified the other 6. He admitted what happened, but he said it was consensual, and he said that Reese had been paid. He was sent home with a $250 bond, and no one else was arrested. No one else was questioned. The day after that Reese made the report, her home was firebombed. She actually moved in with her father and her 6 siblings. And her father, for some time after that, spent every night outside up in the tree with a shotgun, keeping watch. So there was a grand jury hearing in October, but because witnesses could not identify every single perpetrator by first and last name, no indictments were issued. But a report was also made to the NAACP, who sent their then rape investigator, a young Rosa Parks, to Abbeville. She actually had family in Abbeville. Rosa Parks was threatened with arrest by a deputy sheriff, and she was physically thrown out of Reese's home. At this point, Parks helped form the Equal Justice Committee for Mrs. Reese Taylor. And a lot of these people on this committee were connected with different groups, mostly labor and civil rights. And they basically helped spread the word about not only the case, but the fact that the grand jury, did not issue an indictment, basically to bring pressure to Governor Chauncey Sparks at the time. And all of this pressure convinced Governor Sparks to actually convene a second grand jury the next year. So at that point, the governor sent investigators to Alabama to interview some of the law enforcement as well as the sheriff, who they gave different information at that time. And the sheriff said that, quote, Reese was, quote, nothing but a whore, close quote. Investigators spoke with the alleged perpetrators. 4 out of 7 said that Reese had been paid. 3 out of the 7 said they weren't there. And 5 out of the 7 said she got in the car willingly. So again, the second grand jury convened the next February and again issued no indictments. So at that point, the Alabama Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor sort of broadened its scope to support other survivors going through similar situations. So at this point, we're seeing organized advocacy for survivors, not only in general, but through the criminal justice system when it fails to meet their needs. And an interesting tidbit about Governor Sparks, in the fall of that year in 1945, he would give then 24-year-old George Wallace a job as a clerk. And we'll hear about George Wallace again before we're done here. So when I say others going through similar situations, I want to just point out some of, the folks that we know of. These are the folks that are covered in the book At the Dark End of the Street. And I thought it was important to include them. So I mentioned with the case of Murtis Dixon that it was fairly common for older white men to pick up young black women, teenagers, on the pretense of paying them for either house cleaning or babysitting, only to drive somewhere secluded and assault them. And this was made all the more easier because they literally lived in separate parts of town because of redlining. Some of the names here we have a little bit more information on, notably Ruby Pigford. After being raped, she was tied to the bumper of her rapist's car. She was actually dragged through town, and amazingly, she did not die. Gertrude Perkins was refused a list of who was on duty the night she was raped by a law enforcement officer, and she was refused a lineup. A committee formed calling for a grand jury. After meetings and letters from the NAACP and a lot of media attention, a grand jury did convene, but they determined that Perkins was a, quote, prostitute, close quote, and issued no indictments. So we can see here there's a couple of cases where the role of segregation laws either facilitates the abuse or is an excuse for the abuse. And we also see that at least a couple of times, the perpetrators are members of law enforcement. So when we think about the idea of, seeking quote unquote justice, it's important for us to remember that, this is the design of the system, is to preclude some people, certain people, right, people of color, from getting that justice. Lastly here, Flossie Hardman's case, it actually was pushed to trial, but an all-white jury delivered a not guilty verdict after about 5 minutes of deliberation. And I have this little asterisk in the corner here because I want to just point out that we know that this list is largely incomplete. Because these were just the folks that were brave enough to tell someone what happened, either to make a report through police or through the NAACP, so that we otherwise know about it. But it goes without saying that there are many, many more. So I just wanted to give another content warning, well, a specific content warning for this next slide, because it includes some of what I mentioned earlier when we were talking about lynching and the idea that, or the fact that memorabilia was created at these events. And I vacillated a lot on whether or not to include some of that memorabilia. And I want to point out that there's a really good point in the takeaway in as the meta conversation in terms of like circulating the last moments of someone's life and the idea of circulating a lynching, a trauma. And even today we see countless videos, photos, recordings of the last moments of a Black person's life. And that circulating that trauma in many ways perpetuates the harm. And while I wanted to be mindful of that, of course, I thought it was important for us to really understand the level of callousness and cruelty that went into these spectacle events that literally thousands of people would attend. So that's why I did choose to include it, but I do want to just point out before we go to the slide that there is a black box, over the body of the victim, because that's not necessarily why this graphic is included. It's included because it is a postcard produced from that event. So as I mentioned, there's a box over the body of the victim. Their name was Jesse Washington, who's 17 years old. This was in 1916. He was convicted of raping and murdering a white woman, which again, when we say convicted, it's important for us to remember that this trial may not have actually even really occurred. I wanted to include this because not only is it a postcard, but that in the portion of the photo that is not covered, we can see that there's a pretty decent sized crowd. Some of them appear quite young. You can see even here there's some faces of some small people who don't appear to be altogether shocked by what's going on here. Beneath the one side of the postcard is the other side of the postcard, and we can see that whoever sent this referenced, quote, the barbecue we had last night, close quote. It's difficult to fathom the level of brutality that this terrorism involved and instilled in people, and that this was, again, the norm. And even though it's very difficult, maybe impossible for us to wrap our minds around, I wanted to challenge us to try and to understand that this was happening literally all over. So the slide is called a deadly double standard because, again, on the prior slide where we saw this long list of survivors of Black women and girls who were assaulted and who, again, if they got a grand jury or a trial, it was almost, in name only. And very often, no arrest happened, no report was taken, no grand jury was convened. Yet we see here when a Black man is accused, right, of raping or murdering or anything else toward a white woman, the punishment is painful and public death. So some of these folks, like I mentioned, were accused of sexual violence, but others were not. Sergeant Isaac Woodard, he was actually a World War II veteran. He was in his uniform after being discharged. He was arriving home. He was riding on a bus from Georgia to North Carolina. He had an argument with the driver about allowing him to use a restroom at a stop, and the driver called the police, who were South Carolina police. When they arrived, they attacked, they beat, and they permanently blinded the sergeant. The state refused to pursue the case. Actually, President Truman demanded a federal investigation. The sheriff was indicted at that point and went to federal trial. But once again, a similar theme, an all-white jury would acquit the perpetrators. Maceo Snipes, who was another World War II veteran, he was actually murdered in the street on Election Day. And between January and February of 1946, uniformed police killed 5 black veterans at voter registration drives. So again, if it wasn't about sexual violence or accusations thereof, it was about accessing voting. The Martinsville 7 were 7 black men, 6 were between the ages of 18 and 20, who were convicted and they were executed. Each trial lasted less than 1 day for, again, the accusation of raping a white woman. Mac Ingram was actually convicted of, quote, eye rape, unquote, for looking in the direction of a farmer's 18-year-old daughter. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, and the case was fought by the NAACP, and it was actually eventually dismissed 2 years later. And we all know what happened to Emmett Till, or at least I think we do. He was 14. He was tortured to death for allegedly whistling at a white woman in a convenience store. This woman actually admitted in 2017 that she had lied about him whistling at her. But because his photos of his open casket funeral were published in Jet magazine, they were very widely circulated, and it changed the landscape of understanding the Deep South and anti-Black violence to many folks who had kind of desensitized themselves to it, or they were up in the North and kind of didn't see these things and kind of had shied away from the realities. So again, as victim advocates, it's counterintuitive for us to advocate for mercy upon the accused. And while the accused might have been guilty, the multitude of other factors means we actually will never know the truth. And we already know of several cases where the accused was exonerated, and sometimes they were already dead. We also know that the same time period where these accused people received swift and painful death, white men who were accused of assaulting black women weren't even worthy of a criminal report. So knowing that, it's pretty obvious to me that the issue was not, justice for sexual assault survivors in and of itself. And that more often than not, it appears that sexual violence against white women was merely the vehicle to act upon extremely violent and, again, terroristic intentions. So when we talk about these coalitions that have been formed for survivors and to advocate for survivors, and again, how they were often linked to different civil rights groups, labor defense leagues, things like that, the coalitions that had gathered around to support individual survivors, such as Reese Taylor, quickly evolved into the Women's Political Council. And by 1955, the Women's Political Council had 3 chapters and more than 300 members in Montgomery, Alabama alone. Many were women who, rode the buses every day to work, and they were harassed on the bus, and they were accosted or thrown off the bus by drivers and police if they resisted or if they disobeyed, these segregation laws that were, the most ridiculous, dehumanizing, racist things. So by 1950, petitions were already circulating, and people were already storming city council meetings in the early 1950s. And in 1954, letters were sent to the Montgomery mayor after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was from the Supreme Court, that said that public institutions, such as schools, could not be segregated on the basis of race. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But after that decision, letters were sent to the mayor of Montgomery intimating that a boycott was imminent. So when we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, things had been sort of percolating for a while. And Rosa Parks was actually not the first person to publicly resist these laws and to even be looked at as possibly the face of this movement, by the local NAACP chapter. So our first instance of this is actually Claudette Colvin, who this photo was taken in 1954 when she was 14, but she was actually an NAACP youth council member, and she was on the bus on her way home from school, and the driver demanded that she stand over an empty seat because the seat that she was in was facing a seat that a white couple was in, and that wasn't allowed. There was nobody else on the bus. It was just, you have to stand because this seat is facing these people, and so you cannot sit in it. And so she refused. The driver called the police. They dragged her off the bus, and they took her to jail. And the whole time she was in the car on the way there, the officers were making sexual comments about her body, guessing, her bra size, and she was terrified that she would actually be assaulted. And she was actually arrested for assault and for resisting arrest. So when a committee formed for her release and they called for a boycott, she was, actually found guilty of violating the segregation laws and sentenced to indefinite probation, which the NAACP appealed the case, but the verdict was upheld and she was declared a juvenile delinquent. And she was actually eventually one of the 5 plaintiffs in the Supreme Court case that struck down, the segregation of buses in 1956, and she's actually still alive. So at this point, the Montgomery bus boycott, they were just waiting for a, quote, sympathetic figure, close quote. And because Claudette became pregnant out of wedlock, they decided that she was not going to be a good face for the movement. So the second option was Mary Louise Smith, who also was thrown off the bus in a similar manner, but because she lived, quote, in a poor neighborhood, quote, and her father drank too much, then maybe she was not as respectable a candidate either. And the person I'm quoting is E.D. Nixon, and he was actually the branch president of the NAACP in Montgomery, and he was waiting for, again, a respectable person to represent the boycott, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And they got that person when Rosa Parks was forcibly removed off the bus. And this bus driver had thrown her off of a bus in 1943. And we know the climate, and Black women knew the climate at the time as well, because we know the first words her mother asked when she finally was able to speak to Rosa from inside the jail. The first thing she asked on the phone was, "Did they beat you?" So allies and organizations decided that this was it. And so before she was even out of jail, they were calling for a boycott the following Monday. So this began on Monday, December 5th, 1955, and it lasted for more than a year. Once the boycott began, she was kind of positioned as this demure woman who just so happened to be the one arrested, and she sparked this kind of quote-unquote spontaneous movement. And that was not an accident. It's because organizing a boycott was illegal. And actually, the following February, 89 indictments were returned for folks who were organizing this boycott. And the way she dressed, this kind of Puritan, matronly style, none of that was an accident. And when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was arrested and convicted for helping plan it, he was kind of catapulted into sainthood. And, Rosa Parks and the other women who had organized this movement for literal years sort of just kind of stepped to the back. So a couple more notes on the politics of respectability. It's generally defined as what happens when a minority or a marginalized group, they're told or they teach themselves, that in order to receive better treatment, from the group in power, that they must behave, quote unquote, better. And according to an article from The Root that I read, they mentioned that if we walk a little straighter and write a little neater and speak a little clearer, then white people will treat us better. To me, that seems very similar to this narrative of the quote-unquote ideal survivor and the need to position a marginalized community as somebody who's quote-unquote deserving of compassion. And the idea of appearing non-threatening, the idea of appearing as though, it's okay for you to give us, the equality and the rights that we deserve because we're not mad and we're very sympathetic people. And we see here this graphic is actually from a brochure from the Detroit Urban League in the year 1918. So we have kind of like a don't do this on the left and sort of do this on the right. And there's a lot of pushback against that these days. And we see that by characterizing this need to quote unquote be respectful as tone policing. This idea that, a survivor has to behave the right way or that you have to protest the right way. Is a lot of times tone policing, and the idea that you have to fit a certain mold in order to be deserving of compassion, deserving of respect, and of those basic human rights. But it was very important for the emerging civil rights movement at the time because they understood the pragmatic power dynamics at play and indeed, the inherent risk of violence. And so it became a big position of, Martin Luther King and the politics of nonviolence, the idea that when folks are positioned as, they're literally doing nothing except sitting there or carrying signs, and they appear to be, good, respectable people, then it makes the violence wrought upon them that much more obvious and that much more inexcusable. So it wasn't done without purpose, but in these times especially, it's important for us to really examine, whether or not we're tone policing. So as the 50s rocket on, the next battlefront was kind of education. And I mentioned a little bit about the Brown versus Board of Education. It was the Supreme Court decision that, again, desegregated public institutions. So the really front line of that was public schools. So before we dive into this slide, on the right-hand side up here are sexual assault survivors. And it's just important to point out that, again, even through these fights over these quote-unquote separate issues, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and survivors using their voices to actuate change are right there. So Melba Pattillo was actually a member of the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine was in 1957 when 9 high school students were the first to attend an integrated public school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And when the governor refused to let them in, President Eisenhower sent in 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne to enforce the desegregation. So Melba was a member of that. Annette Butler was another survivor who, again, was assaulted on Mother's Day. And Daisy Bates was a writer for the Arkansas Free Press. So she was actually the daughter of a victim of sexual assault and murder when she was a little girl. And that whole time, the experience of her mother shaped her perception of the world around her, and indeed how she wrote about the Little Rock Nine. And so the Arkansas Free Press was able to, inject some of that clarity into this narrative, and in large ways because of Daisy's individual experience and that of her mother. So the White Citizens Council, this first bullet, they were actually founded 4 days after the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down. So the White Citizens Council was rooted in the fear of interracial sex, or quote unquote race mixing, which was where this phrase miscegenation came from. It's literally a word that means like race mixing, impurity in the race, and like it's a fake word, but they were very afraid of that happening. And they spread a lot of propaganda because they were gravely concerned that their children were going to go to school with Black children and that they would not inherit their children would not inherit their views. So the WCC spread just propaganda about Black on white rape, like, again, Birth of a Nation, that old drum that we can just keep on beating because people were very scared of that. And they did that to resist school integration. The core of the resistance to integration was white supremacists' fear that eventually their kids would form relationships with and perhaps have sex with Black kids. The Kissing case was in 1958, where a 7-year-old white girl told her parents that a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, they were both Black boys, they had all played a game where they kissed each other on the cheeks. And the boys were arrested. A lynch mob was outside the jail for 6 days, and parents actually only found out about this incident because they were forced from their homes by a burning cross, people shooting up their home, and actually one of the boys' families, their dog was actually shot as well. Both of the boys were tried and sentenced to indeterminate terms at Morrison Training School in North Carolina, and they were stuck there for until they were released, until a local NAACP leader, Robert Williams, led the effort to pressure and to bring bad press to the governor of North Carolina until he released the 8-year-old and the 10-year-old boy 4 months later. And in 1957, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida passed more than 450 acts or resolutions to maintain white schools. There were, at this time, 530 acts of segregationist violence and economic intimidation between 1954 and 59. And at this time, state officials explicitly said that their goal was to, quote, nullify Brown, right? The idea of undermining the Supreme Court decision and to make it moot. So our graphic for this slide is a picture of Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was 6 years old. She was one of 4 little girls who integrated New Orleans public schools in the year 1960. And 3 of the 4 girls went to one school, and Ruby went to another school. And the white students at the school were all pulled by their families, by their parents. So she went to school in an empty building with just her and her teacher. And at 6 years old, she was the target of, death threats. Like, these federal marshals actually went with her to school every day to protect her from the mob. And this was in 1960. So we look at these pictures and they're in black and white, and that makes us sometimes think that they were a long time ago. But these photos are actually both Ruby Bridges in 1960 here on the right and in 2017. So Ruby Bridges is a part of history, quote unquote, but is still very much alive. And it makes it seem like, black and white photos are like sort of in the past that nobody who's alive right now can remember. But this is actually very, very, very much living memory for many of our relatives. So for these next couple of slides, we are actually going to the state of Florida. And before we dive in with Betty Jean Owens, to provide some context here on the right-hand side. So in the state of Florida, for the first 34 years of using the electric chair as capital punishment, had seen 37 black men accused of rape. All of them were executed, and no white men who were accused of rape were executed. Prior to that, Florida had actually led the South per capita in lynchings. From 1900 to 1930, there were 281 lynchings of 256 black people. Abraham Beard was one of those executed, and he was actually in the same place, in the same court, with many of the same key players as Betty Jean Owens. Mary Ruth Reed was a pregnant sharecropper. She alleged attempted rape and beating. The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes before they delivered a not guilty verdict. Georgia Davis White was a hotel maid, and she also alleged that she had been beaten. The judge dismissed the case without showing up. And both of those cases happened in a nearby county right around the same time as Betty Jean Owens was attacked. So Betty was actually riding in a car with 3 other students from the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, or FAMU. And they were on their way to a formal dance. It was 2 couples, 2 boys, 2 girls. And 4 white men in a car stopped them. One had a gun, one had a knife. They told the men to leave, and the other girl was able to escape. So Betty was abducted at knife point and raped. And the other 3 who had escaped found a deputy who searched with them. The deputy actually found the car. There was a brief chase, and the deputy found Betty in the back of the car, blindfolded and screaming for help. The deputy arrested all 4 of the white boys, who on the way to the jail were not only admitting what happened, but were joking and were bragging about what happened. And Betty was taken by her friends to the local black hospital, because let's remember, at this time, black people were not allowed to seek care in quote-unquote white hospitals. So that was on May 2nd. On May 4th, there was actually a protest at FAMU with more than 1,000 students, and they threatened to just boycott classes if sort of justice was not done. And we see this here on the graphic, this front page newspaper. At the grand jury hearing, Betty actually needed a nurse to come with her to be able to physically attend. She could barely walk. All 4 of the accused perpetrators pled not guilty at grand jury, but they were indicted. And this was the first time that white men who were accused of raping a black woman had been jailed in the state of Florida. This all resulted in international attention and a lot of pressure, not only from civil rights advocates and groups, but also local government and white communities who they said they feared retaliation. So they were literally using the brutal assault of Betty Jean Owens to stoke fears about black men raping white women. So the whole world was watching this trial. So to zoom out very briefly to this left-hand side of the slide, in the summer of 1959, up in South Carolina, the first time a white man who was accused of raping a black woman was not only convicted but sentenced to death in the entire South in the United States. The first time this had ever happened was up in South Carolina this same summer. All right, back to the right-hand side. So the trial was in June of 1959. Betty testified on June 12th. She identified both the gunman and the man with the knife. Medical experts testified about her injuries. The prosecutor actually flashed the switchblade that was used in the abduction. And at this point, the three defense attorneys jumped up. They called for a mistrial, but Judge Walker denied it. And that was one of the many times that Judge Walker actually himself was the vehicle toward, actual justice. Pretty the only one, maybe, who had agency over the situation, enforcing these kinds of things. Betty's friends testified to her condition after they found her. The defense actually at the end of that day, after over an hour of cross-examination of Betty that was absolutely awful, they called for a direct verdict of acquittal at the end of the day, citing that prosecutors, had not presented their case adequately. And Judge Walker denied it. He said, "You will present your case in the morning." So first, the defense strategy was that these young men were ignorant, then that these young men had had dysfunctional childhoods, then that these young men were pillars of the community and would never do such a thing. Then the defense strategy was the idea that the only reason there was outcry was because of these outside agitators. And that would not be the last time that the idea that the only reason there was any kind of anger about this case or that had happened or any reason that this was outside of just the norm was because of agitators from, who do not live here. Crowds assembled outside during the jury deliberation. They deliberated for 3 hours, and the verdict was guilty with recommendation for mercy. So what that meant was that they were guilty, but the jury was specifically not recommending the death penalty. So the reaction was really bittersweet. It was like it was something, but we see this quote here from a Baltimore Black newspaper that this verdict, just made it clear that the death penalty for rape is only when, Black men are accused of raping white women. So on June 21st, Judge Walker issued 4 life sentences. And he received letters at that point from white people who believed that the only reason there was a guilty verdict was because of a communist-inspired NAACP conspiracy. And the letters were full of racist fears that were literally the opposite of what happened, just projecting, this fear that Black men are going to come in and rape white women. And this idea of, again, miscegenation. It always surfaces when white men are afraid of losing their monopoly on power. So Patricia Stevens-Dew was one of the students at FAMU protesting in that crowd. And 6 weeks after the trial, she and her sister started the Tallahassee chapter for the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE. And they began to having sit-ins. And in 1960, they were part of the effort to desegregate local lunch counters, movie theaters, and department stores. So this is just one of the many examples of people coming to rally and support a survivor, and then that advocacy leading to more advocacy and other pursuits of equal rights and justice. And now, as we kind of continue on into the 1960s, we're talking with much more proximity to the effort for access to the right to vote. So a little bit on Fannie Lou Hamer. She was the granddaughter of an enslaved woman, and her grandmother, Liza Bramlett, had 23 children, and 20 of them were conceived from rape. Fannie Lou Hamer's mother actually carried in her lunch bucket every single day a 9mm Luger. So the presence of violence was very much an everyday thing in their lives. And Fannie Lou Hamer was the youngest of 20 children to her mother. In 1961, Fannie Lou Hamer went in to have a cyst removed from her ovaries, and she received a non-consensual hysterectomy, which sterilized her. They were actually so common, they were called Mississippi appendectomies. And this appears as one point of many in this program, but I do want to kind of have an asterisk here that when we think about the violence against Black bodies, it's important for us to point out that there is a very large cross-section of this conversation with regard to harm delivered through the medical system. This includes the experimentation on enslaved women for gynecological research, the manipulation of Black men into the Tuskegee syphilis study, where they were unknowingly infected with syphilis and it went untreated so that researchers could study the effects. This was not uncovered until 1972 and until after 128 people had died. This also includes, the denial of access to places like hospitals and doctors' offices, right? We mentioned with Betty Jane Owens, she had to go to the Black hospital. And, of course, eugenics and forced sterilization, which was rampant into the 1970s. And I noticed a lot of connections to today when we think about healthcare outcomes and we think about how Black women have worse aggregate healthcare outcomes in the United States in nearly every measurable category. So when we think about the legacy of medical harm, it's very much a part of this conversation. And indeed, many people were individually affected by that. And one of them was Fannie Lou Hamer, who was never able to have children as a result of this. In 1962, she was kicked out of her home and off the plantation where she was a sharecropper because she tried to register to vote. She wasn't even successful. She tried to register to vote, and she was again kicked out of her home and off that plantation. So she joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she eventually did pass the literacy test and was given voter registration. On June 9th, 1963, she was traveling with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, with volunteers from Charleston, South Carolina, back to Mississippi, and at a rest stop in Winona, Mississippi on June 9th, 1963, she and a few other volunteers tried to be seated at lunch counters in the bus terminal, which was illegal, so they were arrested and taken to jail. And Hamer, along with Annelle Ponder and June Johnson, who were all part of either SNCC or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, while they were in jail, they were stripped, beaten, and verbally and sexually assaulted by the police. So, after needing a few months to physically recover from the abuse she endured in the jail, Fannie Lou Hamer went right back at it and helped organize Freedom Summer in Mississippi and gave a live speech for the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party at the Democratic Convention in 1964, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Also of note that's coming about into the 1960s is a continued conversation around what is happening to folks like Fannie Lou Hamer and others when they are placed in jails and in prisons, specifically the Freedom Riders. And the Freedom Riders were part of a group whose goal was to desegregate interstate transit, notably buses. And they actually, interracial groups of folks traveled across state lines into states where the buses were segregated on what was called freedom rides. And so in the states where this was illegal, Freedom Riders were threatened, abused, and arrested. So one of the prominent folks in this part of the movement was Dorothy Height. And in October of 1963, Height and other leaders in notable women's groups, because again, women are still organizing at this time, as they always have been and currently were. She and other leaders listened to 65 teenagers in Selma at the First Baptist Church about how they had been treated in jails. And some of what they had heard was that Freedom Riders were taken to Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi. They were given vaginal exams for no reason by COs with gloves that were dipped in Lysol. And this, as well as rape, was reported out of the prison in Jackson, Mississippi as well. They also in jails were very overcrowded, given no blankets, no access to toilets, not enough water or food, and routine threats by the police to let the male detainees into their cells. So as they needed to kind of decide how they were going to survive, usually one of the women would be awake, at all times to sort of keep watch. And as the club women left that meeting in Selma, 50 police had assembled outside of the church. So this very strong resistance, not only to any kind of civil rights, but specifically that of those who are in jails and prisons, was met with a lot of resistance. So this list here on the left, these are all women who we know specifically and who were mentioned in the book as having endured abuse, assault, and sexual violence, specifically by either law enforcement or staff in the jails and prisons. Marion King was actually beaten and kicked, and she was actually 7 months pregnant, and this caused a miscarriage. In 1964, Dorothy Height and the 24 other leaders of different women's groups all coalesced, and they formed the Medical Committee for Human Rights. And one of their first reports and announcements was, the compilation of what they called the indignities to girl freedom demonstrators in Southern prisons. And so here we see a photo of Dorothy Height here on the right, and then on the left is just one of the photos of, freedom riders or other civil rights demonstrators as they were held in jail. So I saw strong connections to our work with those who are incarcerated with this material, because we know that abuse is happening in jails and in prisons, and we know that reform efforts are always met with extreme resistance, and that there was really no sympathy once somebody was deemed, a quote-unquote criminal. So more on Fannie Lou Hamer and Freedom Summer in Mississippi. So the basics on Freedom Summer was that multiple groups nationwide coordinated to send white activists, students to the South to connect with local groups that had been building this grassroots effort to assist with voter registration efforts in Mississippi. And at this time, the local white people literally prepared for war. Mayor Alan Thompson of Jackson, Mississippi, reported that he had acquired 450 police, 220 new shotguns, 6 dogs, and an armored tank. He said, quote, "We're ready for them. They won't have a chance." Quoted that to Newsweek. People vowed that the activists, and this is why they were coming, according to this propaganda, that they were bent on miscegenation, there's that word again, and that they had to defend their, quote, "Southern way of life from beatniks and black rapists," close quote. And we see here this other quote in the top right-hand corner from Newsweek is that everything underneath this resistance to voter registration, people were using the fear of, it's a sexual fear, but using the fear of sexual violence, right? And again, this need to protect white womanhood. So this backlash was very, very violent. So when we talk about Mississippi, there were convictions happening for white men who were accused of raping black women, but nobody was being sentenced to death at this time. In fact, in 1960, L.J. Loden, who had raped a 16-year-old black girl, the jury said guilty without recommending mercy. So this means they're recommending the death penalty. The judge told jurors that they must not have understood what that meant, and he insisted that they modify the verdict. So then this perpetrator received life with parole and 10 years instead. So Freedom Summer included several murders, and if you saw Mississippi Burning, then you already knew about the 3 murders in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which were 1 local black man, James Chaney, and 2 white men from New York City, Andrew Gutman and Mickey Schwerner. And that was a very high-profile murder where they were arrested, held in jail, released from jail in order for local members of the KKK to murder them. And on top of those murders, at least 3 more happened that summer, as well as 35 shootings and 65 bombings of either homes or offices. And when white women showed up for Freedom Summer, white women volunteers, it really got dangerous. Most of the white women volunteers who came down for Freedom Summer were working in offices, both for their safety and for the safety of local black men, because riding in a car with a white woman would cost a black man his life. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed by President Johnson on July 2nd, and the month after that, the Democratic National Convention was happening in Atlantic City. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were literally folks that were being enrolled in Mississippi into this party to demand a seat at the table at this Democratic convention. So they literally stormed the convention in Atlantic City and demanded to be seated as delegates. And here on the right, we see Fannie Lou Hamer giving a speech on live television that we mentioned earlier. And actually, President Johnson saw this happening, and he organized to make a speech at the exact same time to get networks to cut away from her. But then the speech was repeated and broadcast on the evening news nationwide anyway. So, and this quote here in the final bullet was from Fannie Lou Hamer's speech. And it's quite a watch. So how this all shook out was that Senator Hubert Humphrey tried to propose a compromise on behalf of the president that would give the Freedom Democratic Party 2 seats. He stated that this would lead to a reformed convention in 1968, but the Freedom Democratic Party rejected that compromise, and Hamer said, we didn't come all the way up here to compromise for no more than we've gotten here. We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats when all of us is tired. So afterward, all the white delegates from Mississippi walked out. So the Freedom Democratic Party was told that they had accepted 2 at-large seats over a speech to the entire group. And so because this was literally already happening, even though they rejected it, one of the people who was asked to be a seated delegate asked if he could trade his seat so that Fannie Lou Hamer could be one of the 2 delegates. And the leadership of the Democratic Party at the time said, quote, "Miss Hamer cannot be a part of this," close quote. Folks were so afraid of this woman who was able to advocate for herself, was articulate, was able to capture the attention of literally the entire country. She was a big threat to them. In 1968, the Freedom Democratic Party was finally seated after the Democratic Party adopted a clause which demanded equality of representation from the delegates. In 1972, Fannie Lou Hamer was elected as a National Party delegate. And this, in the late 60s, not to tangent too much, but this is part of the subsequent shift of, racist white people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. When folks talk about how, Republicans used to be the Progressive Party and Democrats used to be the Conservative Party, this is part of that switch. That's a very long, complex story that is for another day, but this was definitely part of it. So as we reach 1965, we see the continued struggle for access to the right to vote, which is, again, relevant in the same way that bus boycotts were. It was because of not only the inherent serious and dual risk that female attendees had, but this white fear of, again, miscegenation, there's that word again, and the propelling of rape myths and this related fear. So this was Freedom Summer amplified. So White Citizens Council, remember them? They are still pumping all kinds of money, propaganda, fear into the communities, into white people. And again, this is all around the idea that Black people are coming to be violent, to perpetrate sexual violence, and to, have orgies or other kinds of immoral sex and things like that. So when we talk about this propaganda, when we talk about the White Citizens Council, everybody was involved in this. TV personalities, people who own banks, people on the radio, the local government, the local police, the sheriff's department, all these folks are a part of the White Citizens Council, including George Wallace, who, remember him? The person who was hired as a clerk in Governor Chauncey Sparks' office. He's now governor of Alabama. He's the famous one that said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So he's still around, as well as Sheriff Jim Clark, who's actually the sheriff in Selma, Alabama. So Jim Clark actually carried a .38 pistol and a cattle prod when he blocked the door for voter registration activists. And in one of these drives, he grabbed Amelia Boynton, who is the head of the Dallas County Voter League. He grabbed her out of line, threw her onto the ground, and arrested her for criminal provocation. People kept gathering, people kept marching, and police kept kind of ratcheting up this harassment. He actually also used that cattle prod to force 8 school children to march 3 miles out of town to a gravel pit because they had a silent demonstration at the courthouse for civil rights. So a lot of different national groups planned a Selma to Montgomery march to raise awareness and to encourage folks to register to vote and to actually go to the courthouse to register to vote. And Governor Wallace declared that day a, quote, danger holiday for female state employees. It was so violent that the white women who worked in the governor's office were excused from work that day. Wallace ordered troopers and local patrols on horses to prevent the march. They amassed in riot gear on the Edmund Pettus Bridge across Highway 80. Mayor John Cloud ordered the crowd to disperse over a megaphone, and police marched forward with clubs out to the line of protesters in silence. So there's this, sort of building tension, silent encroachment of these two lines of people, both the protesters and the police. And then Sheriff Clark let off some tear gas. Police began to charge forward, beating the protesters. And we're talking about horses trampling people, people being hit with boards, people being hosed, people being just beaten, and women and children, all kinds of folks. Live TV was interrupted to talk about this event or to show footage from this event, and it was called Bloody Sunday. And Dr. King, who was there, called for another march, calling supporters to Selma. So at that point, local White Citizens Council efforts were obsessively pushing the idea that civil rights activists were purveyors of orgies, sex in churches, activists who were returning pregnant. I mean, the march hadn't happened yet here are people returning pregnant. And of course, that protesters were being paid. More familiarity. Protesters being paid, who again are from outside of town, outside agitators. And George Wallace was quoted as saying, "Since left-wingers spent millions, we can too." So with federal protection, the march from Selma to Montgomery happened a few days later. And here we see this quote from John Lewis about how segregationists are always preoccupied with interracial sex, which is why you see so many shades of brown on the march. I just think it's so interesting that this propaganda revolves around the fear of sexual violence, yet historically, the very bodies that are generating this fear are the ones who either perpetrate or excuse the perpetration of sexual violence when it's against Black women. So this is one of the only times where we're talking specifically about one specific white woman. So this is Viola Liuzzo. She was a white woman who was from Detroit, who saw Bloody Sunday on television and answered the call, went to Selma to help. She was bringing marchers home in her car, and she had 19-year-old Leroy Moten in the car with her. They were seen by 4 members of the KKK who chased the car, shot up the car, thought they killed them both, but Moten would survive, and he went for help. But Viola Liuzzo was dead. Within 24 hours, the FBI painted Liuzzo as an unfit mother, a race traitor, a prostitute, and there were multiple reports that she and Moten were sitting close, they were necking. People said that she had marks in her arm from doing dope, and all these things were quote-unquote leaked to the KKK, as well as reports that she was, quote, fat, braless, and found with no underpants, close quote. They called her a white N-word, and J. Edgar Hoover discouraged President Johnson from calling her husband to give condolences. So during the trial, 3 of the Klansmen were tried. It's thought that the 4th one was actually an FBI informant. And during the trial, the defense counsel, rifled through her things. They held up her NAACP card as though this was proof that she and Moten were sexually linked. There were people in the courtroom talking to reporters who, of course, they printed everything. They swore eyewitness to her, quote, immoral sex, close quote. And 10 jurors voted for manslaughter and 2 held out for an acquittal until there was a mistrial. And there was a really strong sense that Liuzzo was culpable for what happened to her because she wasn't in Detroit with her children. Sheriff Clark actually was quoted as saying, "A mother of 5 would have been home with them. My wife was," close quote. And a survey that was done in the Ladies' Home Journal, national magazine, the results were 55% felt strongly that she should have stayed home, and only 26% felt that she had a right to go. I just find this a very profound example of how, even though all of this violence wrought against Black people, Black men specifically, is in the name of protecting white womanhood, in this instance, we see that some white women, are not given this idea that they are pure and worthy of protecting and things like this. When white womanhood steps outside the bounds of serving white supremacy, we see how quickly they are not given, any kind of support, and in fact blamed for being murdered. So as the 60s, again, roll forward, a lot is happening, right? Everybody kind of historically knows the 1960s were a wild time, lots going on. Here in the top right-hand corner, Rosalie Coates, she's a rape survivor in Mississippi, and it was the first life sentence in this county's history where a white man was given a life sentence for raping a Black woman or girl. So we see small, inches toward change, toward reform, right? And so the 60s is evidence of a couple other, gains, but also a couple of things that were not so awesome. I'm not going to go over every single bullet on this slide. I do want to point out ones that may not be as well known. The Moynihan Report was released in 1965 by the Department of Labor, and it blamed matriarchy for the crisis on Black family pathology and degeneration. So it wasn't that poverty and rising crime was the result of discrimination, of violence and sexual violence, of redlining, or of, again, systemic racism. Again, this is not a bug, it's a feature. And that, when poverty and rising crime are happening, it's not the result of all of those things, but it is the result of Blackness. So here's the Moynihan Report, just kind of creating a narrative that, puts quote unquote evidence, behind the idea that it's Black people's own fault for being marginalized, for being systemically denied access in society. So kind of moving through some of the rest of these points, the March Against Fear was actually James Meredith walking from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi to the University of Mississippi. He had actually been the first Black person accepted to the school in 1962, and he persisted through racist harassment and total isolation to earn his degree in 1963. But he started this march to sort of raise awareness around how difficult it was to be a student in mainstream higher education. And on the second day of this March Against Fear, he was shot. And as he was hospitalized, others continued the march. When he rejoined them, he was one of 15,000 people. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia was decided. That was the Supreme Court decision that ruled that bans on interracial marriage are unconstitutional. And that is kind of another, I think, an asterisk on this point. Like, when we think about the idea that interracial marriage was literally against the law in many places up until 1967, it's always interesting to me when I realize that, the legality of my father's marriage is younger than he is. And then as we move into 1968, We see some good things like the Fair Housing Act, or part of the Civil Rights Act being the Fair Housing Act to try to combat some redlining. But then we also see very difficult things such as the assassination of Dr. King and, the subsequent riots after that assassination. And in 1968, the presidential election, and as we said at this point, the shift among racist whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party is happening. And George Wallace actually ran as a Democrat for president in 1968. He received 13.5% of the vote, but he received 30% of the vote of Democrats in Wisconsin and Indiana. He received 43% of the vote for Democrats in Maryland, and he received 70% of all of the votes in Beaufort County, North Carolina, which is where we are headed to next. I've also heard it pronounced Beaufort County, so I may switch back and forth between those. But some context here on the right-hand side for North Carolina during this time. So in May of 1970, Henry Merrow, who was an Army veteran, was shot and killed for, quote, talking fresh, unquote, to a white woman. The suspects were tried, but they were acquitted by an all-white jury. And over in Wilmington, which was sort of already by 1970 amplifying and escalating in violence from multiple different spheres, all related to the change in the incremental advancement of rights for Black people that was not without, its own violent backlash. So in, 1968, Wilmington was one of the many places where there were violent riots after the assassination of Dr. King. And we talked a little bit earlier about Dr. King's politics of respectability. And if you were watching the little graphic that popped up on the screen during that slide, was that it did not, the politics of nonviolence did not save him from being assassinated. And at that time, I believe it was Malcolm X who was quoted as saying, the white people don't know it, but their very best friend is dead. Because he was the one who advocated for nonviolence and being respectable, whereas there were other folks who did not share that philosophy. So after the assassination of Dr. King, just as we saw on the slide for all the 1960s business, there were lots and lots of riots as sort of people grieving, people calling to action, people expressing the rage after this. And in 1969, when a school in Wilmington was integrated, the KKK engaged in their own, violent rioting and sort of the backlash from integrating the school. And in 1970, after the murder of Henry Merrow, there was a white-owned grocery store that was firebombed. And when firefighters went to that grocery store, they said that they were shot at from across the street from a church, and they arrested everybody in that church. And that was 10 folks who became the Wilmington 10. They actually would all be acquitted and released from jail, but they wouldn't be actually completely pardoned until 2012. So in North Carolina at this time, there is like tremendous attention and just a lot of very notable activist people in North Carolina at the time. And that brings us back to the Beaufort County Jail. So her name is pronounced Joanne, but her name was spelled as Joan. So that's why we see the kind of two different spellings here on the side, because these folks with their signs, justice for Joanne, they spell her name how it's pronounced, but her name's actually shown spelling that I've seen is here on the top left. So she was actually in and out of jail at the time in August of 1974 for burglarizing homes. She actually had a couple of just rough years and been in and out of jail a couple of times. And so she was there on August 27th of 1974. She was approached in her cell by white jailer Clarence Alligood, who was 62. And he entered her cell with an ice pick in his hand, and he forced her to strip and perform oral sex on him. During his moment of orgasm, she stabbed him with the ice pick. She escaped from jail. He was actually found dead, naked from the waist down, with, active ejaculate running down his leg. It was very clear what had happened here. She was actually on the run until September 7th, and she was dubbed a, quote, dangerous outlaw by law enforcement that was searching for her. And her trial of killing in self-defense and the support behind her was something of a turning point because she was not seen, as a sympathetic survivor. So this photo here on the left is Joanne during the trial, and then here on the right are protesters advocating for justice for Joanne Little. So we've already talked a little bit about the Wilmington 10, and so there were a lot of notable folks in North Carolina at the time. So the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression to Joan Little was formed fairly quickly, including key players like Angela Davis, because they were already in Wilmington. So during the trial, various women's groups, the NAACP, and chapters of Free Joan Little groups that included one in Detroit that Rosa Parks started, they were all working to raise awareness and to fundraise for her defense. They raised a combined total of $250,000. They also lobbied and had a successful effort to move the trial to Raleigh because it had a much larger and more diverse pool of potential jurors. And that was a big deal in terms of, folks have heard me repeat a couple of times throughout this program that routinely people are acquitted by all white juries. So the need to move the trial to a jury that more accurately reflects the communities was very important. So Joanne Little's defense attorney was Karen Galloway, who in this photo here on the top right-hand corner, she is on the right. She was actually the first African-American woman to graduate from Duke Law School. And on the day she passed the bar exam, she was named a co-counsel for Joanne Little. And on July 15th, 1975, the defense actually presented 3 other women who Clarence Elliott had assaulted or who had propositioned while they were in jail. The jury deliberated for 78 minutes, and then they acquitted Joanne Little of first-degree murder. So these photos, I mentioned the photo here on the top right, that's Joanne and Karen right after the acquittal, smiling away. And beneath that are 2 different photos of protesters that were gathered outside and shouting power to the ice pick. You can actually see it on the protester here in the middle on her shirt. And here on the left is a political cartoon of Joanne Little and Karen Galloway, quote unquote, knocking out Jim Crow. And that appeared in several newspapers. The idea that the tide was turning was definitely happening. And then just to round out our photos here in the bottom right-hand corner, we see a strong and positive message of defending Black womanhood. So now that we're into the 1970s, it's becoming more mainstream to have organized and funded movements to specifically support sexual violence survivors. So the National Organization for Women, or NOW, was started in 1965. And by 1973, they started a NOW Rape Task Force. And their first priority at the time was to investigate local and state laws regarding how sexual violence was defined, regarding marital rape, right? And, we know that the fight against marital rape went on into the 1990s. And at this time, rape crisis programs in, proper form, formed by state localities being given funding, those started to show up in the following years. And as second wave feminism and the reproductive rights movement took off, white women took center stage and they began testifying about their experiences as survivors, which was not in and of itself a bad thing, but there was a real strong sense or takeaway that they were the first people to ever do this. And that wasn't true. They were actually upstaging, Black women and women of color who had been doing this for, at this point, more than a century, if we think back to I.W. Wells. So progress in the 1960s and 70s on the criminal definitions of rape in each state's different penal code, and it took part as sort of the larger women's liberation movement. And as organizations for civil rights and the NAACP, started to put their focus more toward the need to end capital punishment. So we see as, women's liberation organizations, reproductive freedom movements start to gather steam, that they sort of take on the advocacy for sexual violence survivors, and that civil rights groups at this point pivot toward criminal justice reform, eliminating the death penalty, and getting those wrongfully accused, exonerated and out of prison. So we see that kind of dovetailing right around here in the early 1970s. And on July 2nd of 1973, the Rape Crisis Service, a volunteer program of Planned Parenthood of the Rochester and Genesee Valley, launched from humble beginnings. And that Rape Crisis Service volunteer program would eventually evolve into the organization I work for today, Restore Sexual Assault Services, which is a program of now Planned Parenthood of Central and Western New York. So just some photos here on this slide. In the top left-hand corner is a rally in Boston in August of 1976. And in the bottom right is a photo from the Harvard Crimson of their first Take Back the Night march on November 8th of 1980. I want to remind everybody that although this PowerPoint presentation program is going to start to wind down on its kind of examination of history, that sexual violence obviously continued on through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to today. And while we, again, are doing our best to capture the material presented at the dark end of the street and cover this breadth of material in the amount of time that we have to do it, I just wanted people to not lose sight of that awareness, and indeed the awareness that sexual violence, harassment, dating domestic violence, and stalking occurs for Black women and women of color and LGBTQ plus people at a comparably higher rate than white populations and than straight or cisgender populations. And specifically when we think about murder, it's important for us to be very mindful that although Black trans women make up a very minuscule percentage of our population, they represent a tremendous proportion of those who are murdered each year. And although this program does not go into depth in terms of beyond, again, the early 1970s, and I think that's for a reason. I think Danielle L. McGuire's book, At the Dark End of the Street, aimed to capture how Black women were able to galvanize a movement where there wasn't concerted organization, funding, energy, where they had made a way out of no way, all the way from, the 1800s up through the 1970s. And again, in the 1970s, there started to be formal mechanisms of funding, of staffing, of advocacy. And so I believe that that's, where that decision was made and that it wasn't the wrong one. But for our purposes here, I want everyone to be very mindful that, the story doesn't end here, right? And as we think about wrapping up this program and conversations to have as we move forward, it's important for us to continually examine the disparities and the amplified presence of Black women and women of color and LGBTQ plus people in the population of survivors and victims that we serve. So at this time, we circle back to Reese Taylor. Reese had no more children after she had been attacked. She actually eventually separated from her husband, Willie Guy, and she moved to Florida, and she worked as an orange picker. Her only child, a daughter, was killed in a car crash in 1967. She returned to Abbeville to be with her family toward the end of her life. Reese Taylor watched Obama's inauguration from her father's house in the same community as it had been in the 1940s. The assailants and their families still lived nearby. Her brothers actually watched them as the years passed and couldn't do anything. Many people in town treated her whole family badly or harassed the family for years after the case was dismissed. Her father, Benny, would regularly go to the police station for updates, and he was always turned away. This photo was taken when she visited the White House in 2011, and a month before that, the state of Alabama issued an apology from the state legislator to Reese Taylor, who was then 91. She actually received the apologies on Mother's Day in 2011. And on that day, she visited the Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, which was the same church that she had been worshiping at before the crime happened. She said that day, quote, "I felt good. That was a good day to present it to me. I wasn't expecting that," close quote. Reese passed away on December 28th, 2017, 3 days before her 98th birthday. She was buried next to her daughter at the new Mount Zion Free Will Baptist Church. So here on the slide, we have not only our picture of Reese Taylor at the White House, but a kind of prompting question of what now? What do we do with this information? How is this going to change? How are we going to use this information to change our behavior or to engage in our roles differently? Will we do that? Is it necessary? I'm not looking for any answers to these questions. I'm just asking for us to think about it. And indeed, as we start to ask ourselves these questions about what we do now that we know this history, and how does this history connect to what we're doing every day and our roles, I mean, we see very clearly how sexual violence continues to manifest today, and how white supremacy can really factor into not only how that violence manifests, but whether or not those survivors feel that they had justice served. And I look at that and I see what through lines is not only like the plot device among like different books in a series where you might see like a connecting theme, but also where you can see that common element in a very clear line all the way back to before our nation was even called the United States. Through Line's also a great podcast by NPR. But these statistics were all calculated by the United States Department of Justice and as late as 2018. And the ones that are displayed here on the slide are that 1 in 5 Black women are survivors of rape. 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors in the United States are Black. For every Black woman that reports rape, there are 15 more who do not. And that 40 to 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact before they turn to 18. So when we think about how violence may disproportionately impact people and how that may be related to white supremacy, it's not only an insight that we are now learning, but that information that we can share to other folks that may not be up to speed with regard to all of this context. And when we observe these patterns and these through lines, we are then in a position to criticize them and to question them and to ask if this really is the way that society has to operate, and if there are ways that we can advocate for deeper and more thorough change. So I mentioned at the beginning of this program that this is not meant to be the end of a conversation, but rather the beginning. And so that resource sheet of just kind of articles and or places to learn more, we put a bunch of links in there in terms of the current status and goings on in the ways that sexual violence can manifest for survivors who are in Black communities. Because indeed, the more we look, the more there are direct connections from things that are happening today all the way back. So when we think about certainly this history, again, in both ways that are maybe a rather distant past and maybe a not so distant past, how does this history connect to recent events in the last, 10, 5 years and current disparities that exist in our own society? And why might it be important for us as advocates for victims and survivors to not only know about this history, but to be able to identify those connections? I've said a couple of times throughout this program that in a lot of ways, these outcomes are not a bug in the system, they're a feature. And the idea of cyclically telling ourselves that the system is working and coming up with reasons why it continues to create these gaps, to create this marginalization, and indeed to continue doing harm, is not evidence that some people are fundamentally less than, but evidence, in my view, that the system is designed to marginalize. And when we know that, it's not necessarily to lead us into despair, but to inject clarity into how we frame these issues as a human, like in our own mind, but also how we frame these conversations and how we deliver services as advocates, and how we have these conversations with, community partners and other professionals. How do we inject that clarity? How do we reframe the conversation and the idea that indeed it's not only important for us to all know about this, but to interrupt this cycle whenever possible? So finally, again, not looking for answers or the right answer, but to really sit with challenging ourselves with why this history matters. Why might it be that today was perhaps the first time hearing about a lot of this material for many of us? And again, what do we do now that we know this information? Will it change our attitudes and behaviors? What will change about our attitudes and behaviors if they do? And our photo here is a little guy at a Black Lives Matter rally in Portland in, I believe, 2020. And his sign says, "End white silence. Black Lives Matter." So I think a big part of the what now is going back to what I mentioned way back in the beginning, was that this program today is ideally not the end, but a beginning. Ideally, it's the starting point, maybe not even the starting point, maybe you've already started, but a foundation for where to learn more. Because many organizations and people who are much more insightful and aware of these impacts than I am have been doing this work for much longer than I have. And I've learned a lot from not only the folks listed here on this slide, but many, many more. And as I said, we engage in various degrees of success and failure. And the thing about failure is that it can be a really great teacher. And if we are open to always continuing to try and continuing to do better, or to try to do better, then we're closer to the right path than not. So all these organizations are, well, most of them are on social media, or have podcasts or have written books. And there may be a couple more that you can think of. And I encourage you to do that and to share that and that information with your friends. And our graphic on this slide is a picture of Tarana Burke with the background of #MeToo. And if you're a rape crisis advocate listening to this PowerPoint, then you probably already know that Tarana Burke is the original founder of the #MeToo movement, which was behind, the viral reckoning that began, in late 2017. So in conclusion, this is one quote by wonderful author, wonderful resource, James Baldwin. And he said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And with that, I want to say thank you for taking part in this incredibly lengthy program and for sitting with the sometimes challenging information, sometimes very difficult information. Once again, my name is Lauren Berger, and I work for Restore Sexual Assault Services. Our hotline number, website, and our social media handle is right there on the slide for you. I encourage you to reach out to us if you have more questions or looking to learn more, or if you or someone is impacted by sexual violence and would like services. I also mentioned that this program does come with a PDF of, a notes page or to learn more, and that will give you a lot more of resources and other forms of media to engage with as you continue on this journey of truly understanding the intersections of sexual violence and anti-Black violence in the United States. So thank you once again, and have a wonderful night, day, weekend, and beyond.